What if the people in ministry, counseling, therapy, are going about sex addiction recovery, porn recovery, all wrong? What if people's desires are not actually the problem? What if the desires are actually the roadmap to the person's healing? This is the premise of the guest on today's show. Typically, we have Catholics on all the time, but today we've got Jay Stringer, an evangelical counselor. He's got a master's in divinity, master's in psychology, that has done research on more than 3,800 men and women, taking a deep dive into what's fueling these unwanted sexual behaviors. You're not going to want to miss today's episode. It's an amazing interview where we really take a deep dive into what our cravings are telling us about our unmet needs and traumas that might need to be healed. And so I apologize in advance if the audio is a little echoey. In preparation for this recording, my 3-year-old thought it would be a good idea to spill an entire bottle of my water onto my MacBook, thus blowing out one of the ports. And so the audio is a little messy, so bear with me. I'm going to be taking it to the Apple Store soon, see if we can get that thing fixed up, which makes me want to thank all of our supporters on Patreon who make this podcast possible. Little glitches and tech things that need to get fixed like that. You're the ones who help keep the show running. And so if you want to support this mission we've got at Lust is Boring, help get this message out to more and more people, take care of 3-year-olds who spill water on laptops, just go to patreon.com/Jason Everett. You can subscribe and donate maybe $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever, and we'll send you free things in return, whether it's t-shirts, early access to podcast episodes, all that at patreon.com/Jason Everett to become a member of that community. Also want to invite all of you to go on pilgrimage. We're going to be heading out in January with Father Agostino Torres to Italy. We're going to be going to Assisi, St. Catherine of Siena, going down to Rome. We might even be able to make it over to St. Maria Goretti and Nettuno. So if you want to sign up, consider going on this pilgrimage with us. Please just go to chastity.com/pilgrimage. We just opened up the reservations, so there's time to jump in right now and get your spot. We'd love to go with you and visit the very heart of the church, the tomb of St. John Paul II. We've already got reservations for the Scavi tour to go underneath the main altar at St. Peter's Basilica to see the bones of St. Peter himself. And so if you want to check that out, again, at chastity.com/pilgrimage, we'd love to have you, your whole family with us on that trip. But as I mentioned, today's guest, Jay Stringer, evangelical counselor. He's an author of an award-winning, best-selling book, Unwanted. The subtitle is How Our Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. So I hope you enjoy the show. Jay, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the program today. It's a real blessing to have you.
Jason, thank you so much for having me. Honored to be here.
Now, I've heard that, I remember you mentioning in one of your videos that you've worked with literally thousands of people wrestling with this issue of not just pornography, but undesirable sexual desires, behaviors that they've been trying to break free from. How did you get into this field? And, how have you been able to be in touch with that many people that have kind of poured their hearts out to you in terms of the victories and the setbacks on their journeys?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always think my middle school self would be completely horrified by the job description.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
So, yeah, I want to talk about my own sexual shame for my life's work and earn an income off of that. So I grew up in a pastor's family, and my father was a Presbyterian minister. And so I remember, it was always one of those topics that people would try to reach out to my dad at his home office. And then we had an answering machine, and my family never picked up the phone. So that answering machine was like the original Netflix.
Oh, wow.
And that was kind of the first exposure. Yeah, not good boundaries whatsoever. Yeah. But that was kind of the first exposure to wow, people are not honest on Sundays. They are far more honest about the nature of their life Monday through Saturday. So poor boundaries in my family, but also a sense of, wow, these are where the real stories are being lived out, is kind of in a lot of the sexual struggles and difficulties that people find themselves in. So I went off to seminary, went to a seminary that had a master's in counseling, but also a master of divinity. And that seminary, they had an adage from Carl Jung that said, no leader can take anyone further than they have been themselves. And so, I had a professor just kind of say, if you have not worked through your sexual story, you're not going to be very effective in leading others. If you have not addressed your own trauma background, you're not going to be very good at equipping others to do the same. And so, seminary really pushed me to dive into my story, which I'm so grateful for. And then as I started getting into this field, especially as a therapist, I would look at a lot of the books that were written, and they would either be, in my opinion, like useless or deeply harmful to, like, I would never recommend them to most of my clients. And so that became kind of a search for, why do we have all of this data that would say, porn use is more popular than Netflix, Amazon, Twitter combined? We know how many people are using it. But I didn't feel like there was a lot of work being done to address the roots of that behavior. And so I reached out to, he was a psychologist by the name of Dr. Mark Laser. And one of the things he had told me is, he said, Jay, if you could do an original research study and get about 500 participants, it would be a game changer in the Christian space, because he said most Christians are very lazy, and we tend to just kind of throw out opinions that we believe that the gospel should just change the human heart. And not that that's not true, but it's not surgical enough to the particular stories that we are all living through. So that led to the decision to do some original research. And so I asked about 4,000 people to tell me their story, essentially. So I got, family of origin wounds, I got adverse childhood experiences, what were people dealing with in the present, from a lack of purpose to anxiety to depression. And then we designed the research instrument in such a way that we actually asked about people's sexual fantasies. So not just do you look at porn, but like, what do you actually put into Google, or when you go to that porn site, what are you actually drawn to? And so we put all that into a research instrument, and essentially found that we could predict sexual arousal templates and what people would seek out on the internet and in infidelity, based on the unresolved stories of people's lives. And so that was just like such a huge thesis, is that the problems of our lives are not a life sentence to sexual shame or addiction. They are a roadmap to healing. And so that's the core thesis of my book is, we need to learn how to be deeply curious about our unwanted sexual behaviors, because somewhere in the middle of them, perhaps where it's not apparent to someone now, are clues to the healing and growth that they need.
Wow. No, it sounds like strange expression, but Kinsey redeemed, in a sense of a person who's
Yeah.
deeply curious about human behavior, sexual desire, sexual,
Hmm.
hidden experiences, but a person who's not been healed themselves. Using the research to justify themselves and their own brokenness. And it's funny how God calls people, I think, sometimes into psychology or seminary or whatever, under the pretext like, hey, I want to learn this so I can go, put on my cape and save the galaxy. And like, God's like, yeah, come on in, let's go help people, but he's bringing you in there to heal you. And I think when people don't go through
Precisely.
that, they end up vicariously living through their ministry the healing that they don't want to do themselves. Like, okay, I feel like, okay, I'm helping all these other people as a distraction from actually wanting to address my own core issues, so,
Exactly.
but it makes so much sense, you can't lead somebody further than you've gone down that path. And so you kind of went, I imagine you had your own journey of having to go into the dark place. A friend of mine says your mind is like a bad neighborhood. Don't go in there alone. So he recommends, find a counselor, go to those
You'll
dark
get
places.
accosted. Right?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So you had, I imagine, your own journey of going into those dark places before God was able to use you in this way.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I would say, and we can get into this later on in the interview, but I mean, certainly the kind of the probably core place of my struggle kind of reached its climax in seminary. And so it was like both a point where I was yeah, trying, on that ministry path, like getting into trying to be a pastor, getting into being a therapist, and then realizing that so much of my life was kind of two-stepping, where I had this public persona of the way that I had learned how to present in my pastor family growing up, but then having all of these kind of secretive issues, my own disordered eating, and then that would definitely, lead into a lot of pornography use. And so that was really what I was grappling with in seminary was, I want to be a pastor. I want to invite people to community and to healing and growth and to understand the gospel. But there were also these kind of places of exile and brokenness within my own heart that I had not been able to talk about at that point in my life. And again, like that, so grateful for the seminary that I went through. They required 40 hours of individual psychotherapy in order
Wow.
to graduate. And it's a lot harder to hide when you're in these practicum like moments where, you have people asking a lot of hard, difficult questions about your family of origin, about your style of relating, about some of your sexual struggles. And so I would say I didn't go into that with like this, purity of heart to be able to say, I just really want to grow. It came through just a lot of my own hiddenness and a lot of relational difficulty that I experienced in seminary. So I think, like, I would say I identify with a lot of my patients. Most clients don't come in saying, like, really just want to grow in this area of healthy sexuality. They
Yeah.
usually come in with some type of crisis, some
Mhm.
breakdown. The life that they wanted to lead was not successful. And in many ways, that pathology and that brokenness becomes a gift because they begin to tap into not just the unwanted behaviors, but really the stories beneath those behaviors that are leading to those unwanted behaviors. So,
Yeah, I got an email from a woman recently whose husband is struggling with pornography and has been for decades in their marriage, and it's just broken her to pieces.
mm,
But what she said is that she's realized that her path to holiness, that the cross is not the obstacle to that, the cross is the very means to her holiness. And so sometimes that cross comes in different ways, and her, she's doing a lot of discernment. Okay, what do I need to do? Is he willing to go to counseling? Do we need to call this thing off so he can get the help he needs? But a lot of times
mm,
God allows these wounds and these broken experiences to come right up at the surface for purification of us. And so as I
mhm.
was reading through your book Unwanted, loved it. I don't remember who recommended it to me, and I wish I had it physically here to wave around, but I gave it away to somebody because I knew that it's going to sit on my shelf. I'll use it once in a while, but it's going to go to a lot better use given away. But there were some
Yes.
real gems that you gave in there that I want you to just spend a few moments breaking open for the viewers and the listeners.
Mhm.
One of the things you said is that we are more likely to be ashamed of our unwanted sexual behaviors when we do not understand them. And so could you kind of crack that open in terms of why
Mhm.
a lot of the Christian attempts of lust management just fall short? I mean, good stuff, whether it's, filters or accountability partners, like, kind of band-aids that we're trying to slap all over the
Mhm.
place, why they fall
Yeah.
short, and then why we have so much more shame when we don't get where these desires are coming from.
Sure. So I tend to think about unwanted sexual behaviors in terms of like a river. So if you were to think about like the Mississippi River, one of the reasons why that river is so powerful is it's not just one river, right? So it's fed by, I think the Missouri is the biggest tributary, and then there's the Tennessee, the Arkansas, the Red. So I have no idea how many tributaries it has, but it's a lot. So if you are to understand the Mississippi River, you have to understand the tributaries that flow into it. And to kind of borrow from that analogy, if you want to understand unwanted sexual behavior, you have to look at the various tributaries that flow into that. And I would say the primary Christian approach has always been some type of lust management. And so what they do is they try to go to the headwaters of that tributary and cut it off through accountability, through internet monitoring of some kind. And they're like, great, we've kind of dammed up lust. And then what they find is that that fence becomes something that people actually strategize to go over or
Yeah.
under or around. And lust is always occurring in people's lives. So it's not just that you lust for sex. You can lust to get rid of your marriage. You can lust to get married. You can lust to have children. You can lust to get rid of your children. So that nature of the human heart is not ever going to be contained through internet monitoring or from some level of accountability. But then we also look at tributaries like trauma, tributaries like eroticized rage. And if you don't have a hermeneutic or a framework to begin to address those other tributaries, that's all going to lead into that river of unwanted behavior. So I think if we are honest, we know that lust is not the only thing that's driving us to these unwanted behaviors. And I think that's always the danger of a partial truth, is that yes, it's partially true that lust drives unwanted behavior, but it's not the only thing driving it. So
Yeah.
that's what I would say from just like a theoretical standpoint. But in terms of like, being more likely to be ashamed of something when we don't understand it, I'll get into some of my arousal template, and then I'll also talk about some of the research that was done. So let me talk about the research first, and then I'll dive into some of my own story. So one of the things that we looked at was, let's say that you were a man and you wanted to see kind of a college or teen category of porn. Maybe you wanted to see someone with a petite body type. We kind of tagged that as a type of power over other people, and we found that if that was your porn search, you tended to have three key drivers. One was that you had a very strict father growing up. The second was that you had a significant lack of purpose in your life. And then the third was that you had high levels of shame. And so, if we were to just play armchair psychologist for just a minute, we would be able to say, okay, this man who's looking at that genre of porn grew up with a father who was pretty authoritarian, domineering. And so, when you're growing up in a rigid home, that rigid home creates a context for you to feel very powerless in life. And so when you're feeling powerless, that's one of the appeals to porn, is not just about lust, but it gives you this realm of power where you can get exactly what you want when you want it, and also feel like someone is there to serve you, which you can't find anywhere else in life. So that was a key driver. But we also found that a man struggling with a lack of purpose was 7 times more likely to increase his involvement in porn compared to those men who felt like they had a very strong sense of purpose in their lives. And so, again, we have that sense of a lot of people are fighting to stop their unwanted behavior, but are never really fought to discover their purpose in
Yeah.
life. And so, just another kind of place that we can begin to try and, willpower or try and lust manage something
Yeah.
when the behavior, the fantasy itself is actually providing clues to healing. So that would be the research side. On a personal level, where this hit for me was one of the genres of porn that I would seek out was the MILF category. So it was Mother I'd Like to F. And that was always something that I was deeply ashamed by. And so part of my first exposure to that is I was on AOL Instant Messenger and got a link from, a pop-up chat link, and started talking to a woman, and she said, do you want to see a website? And I had said yes, had no idea kind of about being fooled back in the day. Like, porn sites, at least in my mind, weren't a thing. So I clicked on her website and realized it was a porn site. So I blocked her, but I left the internet browser open. And it was that category of porn. And I had certainly seen porn at that point in college. But there was something about that genre that, like, I felt my soul merge with at like a soul level. And so that was the category that I was always go back to. And when I was in my own therapy, kind of processing through why am I drawn to this type of porn, part of what my therapist asked me was to tell her some of the role that I played in my family. And in my family, my dad would often attend to a lot of the pastoral duties. And part of my role in my family was to check in to see how my mom was doing pretty consistently. And so I had a very triangulated or emotionally enmeshed relationship with my mom. So she was always confiding in me about some of the difficulties that she was feeling in life. difficulties that she had in her marriage. And so that kind of became this template for me of relating to women on the basis of some of the needs that they have, and being like a very good son to mothers in my world. And then that began to shape a lot of just the way that I would relate to other women in my life. Was always the sense of they could tell me some of the problems that they were facing with their boyfriends or with their husbands. And that just
Mhm.
became very
Yeah.
problematic in college and grad school. And so part of, what my therapist really helped me to unpack in that season was those relational dynamics that I had learned with my mom, and the anger of kind of being used had to go somewhere. And that was kind of some of the function of pornography, is that it preserves something of that mother wound story, in a way that, gave me a place to find lust, but also a place to find anger and a sense of power over that particular story. So,
Oh,
again, even if you don't fully agree in that interpretation, that's what I think Romans 12:2 is talking about, where it says, "Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world," which would be pornography or lust, "but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And I would say most Christians don't know how to renew their mind because they've never been
yeah.
curious about what's inside. They're just trying to shut it down. And I think that's the role of, good accountability, therapy, the church, is to help people get deeply curious about why they're drawn to certain things. And so that was part of my healing and growth journey. Was, yes, I needed to confront my own porn use, but I also had to go back to some of the stories that drove me to it. And that's where there was that dual grief process of, yes, I'm involved in a broken behavior, but also I come from a deeply broken family, and both need to be grieved.
Yeah, and I think the power of this whole approach is it goes beyond triggers. Because a lot of times we talk about triggers to
Yeah.
this, where one acronym I sometimes use is like, when are you messing up? Blast. Are you bored? Are you lonely? Are you angry? Are you stressed out? Are you tired? These are kind of surface triggers that are kind of helpful to be like,
Hmm.
yeah, it's when I'm bored and I'm lonely, and kind of mapping out the geography of like, when are you messing up? Well, it's first thing when I wake up, or it's 3 in the afternoon when my parents aren't home, or
Hmm.
it's late at night when I can't fall asleep, and then I start doing like, so you're kind of mapping out these externals, but what you're doing is kind of going several layers deeper into the onion of just like, okay, that's just an at the moment, time or place or mood.
Hmm.
We're going deeper, and it reminds me of
Exactly.
a young man I've been corresponding with who's been struggling with this kind of really bizarre, unsanitary fetish fantasy kind of thing he has. And, as I'm trying to help him walk through, okay, where's this coming from? And it's really a demystification of womanhood, that he sees them as a child as
Hmm.
something so shameful, but so mysterious, that he wanted to be able to understand, wanted to unite with. And so, how do you unite with this thing of shame? And we're just starting to slowly peel back. I guess, as you would say, kind of his template. What are some more just bird's eye view common templates? I mean, you don't need to go super deep into them, but what are some other common ones that men or women might be able to relate to? Of like, yeah,
Hmm.
I do search out this stuff. Holy cow, I never realized it might have been tied to this or
Hmm.
that.
Yep. Yeah, I want to comment just briefly on what you said, because I think it's really important. Like, I'm all for helping people to identify their triggers. I'm not for people trying to manage their triggers. So I would say that what we need to do with triggers is instead of trying to suppress them or ignore them, we need to increase our tolerance for distress. So I want people to move through the trigger. I don't want them to avoid the trigger, because those triggers are very important. It could be that someone, that person that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when their parent leaves, that's when they feel a lot of arousal come to them. Well, that trigger is actually probably telling them a clue with regard to where they come from in life. So if you're growing up in a fairly disengaged family, and you discover porn, porn might become some of the first places that you experience something of oxytocin, or you see, a porn actor or actress's eyes, and there's something about just seemingly to have that connection feels like one of the first solid connections that you've ever experienced in your life. And so that sense of, we don't need to condemn the trigger, but we need to be able to say, what's the clue? What's the story that this trigger is telling me? And
Mhm.
how does that relate back to some of that unaddressed pain in someone's life? So, yeah, I agree. Trying to manage triggers is not important, but there are clues within the trigger that really need to be attended to. Um, in terms of common templates, yeah, I mean, I remember doing a training with Dr. Patrick Carnes, Jason, and I think he had said that his team had identified like 214 or 237 different paraphilias. So it's just one of those things where it's like, yeah, there's some things that are very common, but then there's also stuff that might seem very strange or odd. And so
Mhm.
I have worked with kind of the full gamut of sexual templates in terms of what people find arousing. And it's the same process. It's to be able to say, how can we get curious about what the meaning is inside of this and then begin to unpack it? So, since we've talked a lot about men, one genre of pornography that we found in the research was that women disproportionately to men sought out more forms of violent porn comparatively to that of men.
Really?
And in Seth Stevens Davidowitz's book, Everybody Lies, he's a researcher out of, I think, University of Pennsylvania, written a couple of books, but he looks at what do people actually Google, because he would say self-reported data, like the survey instrument that I built, is
Mhm.
always somewhat suspect because
Uh-huh.
people lie about that. But what people can't lie about are their Google searches. And so his research found the same thing. He said if there's a genre of porn that disproportionately appeals to women, it would be that category of violence. And I think
Mm.
there's so many different ways to begin to think about that. I don't think that there's one right answer, but one of the things that I often find with women is that some of their first exposure to porn, what we know from some of the research is that porn tends to be very violent. I think it's like 88% of all porn that's out there has some level of violence to it. So if that's some of their first exposure to
Mhm.
porn, has more of a violent streak to it, that's going to set a template for them. But in one particular client that I was working with, she had a past history of sexual abuse. And one of the things that we often don't talk about with regard to childhood abuse is every abuser is fundamentally working for the pleasure of their victim. And so that's often one of those things that feels hard to understand if you have never been through this, or even if you have and you've dissociated from that, is that when, an abuser begins to relate to a victim, they want to offer them as many moments of connection and even arousal as possible before anything becomes deeply shameful. So they might, notice that you have a really nice voice, or you have a really good arm that you could play high school baseball or football one day. So it's that sense of, most of us come from families that tend to be very rigid or very disengaged. And abusers often position themselves to be something of the antidote to what we did not receive in our
Mhm.
in our childhoods. And so when this woman, as a girl, she began to develop a connection with her abuser was it's even very difficult to use this word, but he was gifted at bringing
Mm.
her to a sense of arousal. And so in the midst of her abuse, she felt a lot of desire for this man.
Mhm.
And as she aged, she had no place in her church or her community to talk through some of that shame. So then that desire that she had became something that she was deeply ashamed for. And so when she went to see me as, a therapist, she was dealing with just looking at a lot of really degrading forms of porn. And she had read my book and was kind of really curious as to why she was drawn to that. And as we started working through that, one of the things that she articulated was that she always hated herself for the arousal that she felt within her own abuse. And so in pornography, she was able to, pursue a type of porn that was, she would say, I didn't have to choose because it was just a level of violence that was being done to the person. And that became something of the arousal template for her in the aftermath of abuse, was something more degrading and harmful. And so the work of healing for her was to be able to see how that genre of porn was, in a way, distracting her from that abuse story where she actually had a lot of longing for goodness and for connection. And so that could be an example as well with,
Yeah.
an arousal template
Yeah,
having
no,
to
I mean,
do more with violence or degradation.
no, I mean, it's fascinating to get to the depths of the roots of some of these things where she's essentially, if it's being forced upon me, then I can't blame myself for being groomed, for falling for this, for being stupid.
Mhm.
And a lot of times when they go through and they suffer that abuse, they take on so much shame that rightfully belongs to the abuser. Well,
Yes,
I could have stopped this. I shouldn't have done this. I could have listened to that person. Why didn't I trust these voices? And they
yep,
just endlessly, I mean, literally for a lifetime, beat themselves up. I
exactly.
remember meeting one young woman who had been sexually abused and raped, and she told me that she came up with a strategy whereby she would never be raped again. And she said it was just to say yes to all the guys, because if I just say yes to all of them, then I can't be raped, because then they can't
Mhm.
go against my no, because I'm just going
Yes,
along with it. And so when you really start to get down to the roots of this stuff, it really shows the how essential it is to have compassion on
mm,
yourself. And one of the quotes that you said in there, you said that healing requires you to pivot from condemning your lack of willpower to addressing the role trauma may be playing in your unwanted sexual behavior. A heart with an ounce of kindness for your life story will accomplish so much more for you than a mind filled to the brim with strategies to combat lust. So could you speak to that?
mhm,
Just the how powerful it is to have mercy on yourself, how powerful it is to have just
mhm.
that ounce of compassion instead of just like, there I did it again, there I did it again, I knew you were a
Yes,
failure, and now you're
yep,
just going back like a dog to eat its vomit. There you are with all the throw up all over your face again.
exactly.
Like
Yep,
why is compassion so powerful and freeing
yeah,
you from a lot of this stuff to get that story
yeah.
told?
Yes. So if we were to bridge kind of, the woman that you were working with, the woman that I was working with, it was so much easier for my client to condemn herself and hate herself for her porn use than to go back to that 8-year-old girl in her story that began to feel a level of desire and connection for this person. And so for her, the work of healing was not found in hating herself. That didn't create change. The work of healing was when she could go back and engage that young girl with compassion to say, I understand that you were something of an emotional orphan in that home. And so when you met this person, you wanted so much goodness from him. And so that was, I think, the work of Romans 2:4, where it says, do you not know that it is the kindness of God that leads to repentance? Most of us think that it's a type of willpower or a type of self hatred that's going to motivate us to change. But what Romans is inviting us into is it is kindness that changes the human heart. And I also think of some of the Beatitudes, especially Matthew 5:4, where it says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." I work with a lot of individuals who ask for a lot of forgiveness for their sexual behavior, but I have never had a client come in to say, what I need more in my life is I need more comfort because of some of the barrenness and heartache that I have been through. And so I think that beatitude is just so powerful to be able to say, like, yes to things like asking for forgiveness and praying for those things, but how many of us have ever looked at some of our childhood stories, some of the heartache in our life, some of the difficulties that we are facing sexually, and being able to say, I want to grieve these realities because I want comfort
Mhm.
in the midst of this. And I think that's what the gospel is all about, is when God comes into human history, God tabernacles in places of weakness throughout the Old Testament, that God shows up in places of exile, in places of Adam's hiding, and doesn't come with a lot of condemnation, but far more comes with a sense of question. So to Adam, it's the question of where are you? To Jacob, who has been struggling his entire life with issues of identity, the angel of the Lord says, "What is your name?" And then to Hagar, who has been immensely traumatized by the first family of the faith, the angel of the Lord shows up to her and says, "Where do you come from and where are you going?" So, what I would submit to people is if you are hearing the voice of God or the Spirit and it's full of accusation and judgment and kind of that sense of why haven't you gotten your act together, I would say that you're not necessarily hearing the voice of God, because the voice of God is often full of curiosity, it's full of kindness, it's unflinchingly honest about where we are and what we have done, but it's never to rub our nose in our own shame. So
Mhm.
I think it's John 18, I could be off on this, but it's after, Peter has just denied Jesus. And there is this sense that, as John writes that, Peter denies Jesus over a charcoal fire. That's kind of the last scene that we see. And then a couple chapters later, maybe in John 21, Jesus is making, this is after the resurrection, he's on the beach and he's making a charcoal fire for his disciples. And it's just that brilliance of, I'm not going to look away from your denial, Peter, but your denial and your brokenness is actually going to be the very grounds for breakfast. And I think
Yeah.
that's what God is up to, is
Yeah.
I'm not going to look away from your shame, but
Yeah.
in many ways, I'm going to create these charcoal fires that actually increase your awareness of your shame. But in the middle of your shame, you're going to know the glorious kindness of my presence in the midst of it. So that's where I think the human heart changes, is not with accountability or internet monitoring or even mere curiosity.
Mhm.
We change to the extent to which we know something of the kindness of God for our story.
Oh, it's beautiful. The importance of comfort. I think a lot of people understand how many would run towards unwanted sexual behavior for the sake of comfort, right? That
Hmm.
I felt just I didn't get a lot of affection as a kid. There wasn't a lot of that connection, that human connection that I found in these websites, and so they have trauma in their life perhaps, and they're going to the pornography to anesthetize that. They're going to that for the
Yes.
dopamine, the rush, the connection, the escape. I think a lot of people can relate to that. But something you mentioned in your book goes a lot deeper, because a lot of times people aren't going back
Hmm.
to comfort, they're actually going back to trauma. And what you said was this, that
Yes.
pornography often involves themes of humiliation, violence, and emotional enmeshment, because porn users who have endured these traumas will be aroused by the eroticizing of these traumas later in life. Can you help unpack that? Like, how does that work? Why would I want to go back, to that
Hmm.
trauma? Why would I want to relive it? Kind of like that scene in the Shawshank Redemption movie where the guy, all he's ever known is imprisonment, and as soon as he gets free, he kind of commits a crime so he can go back to being a prisoner because that's all he's ever known. But why are we doing this when it comes to our sexual behavior? Like, if there's something that was
Yes.
traumatic, why would we want to relive it? Wouldn't we just want to like shove it
Hmm.
under a rug, stuff it in the closet, and be done with it? Kind of unpack
Yes.
the psychology behind why we would ruminate or marinate in our own brokenness.
Yeah, it's a great question, because it is one of those things that I get asked about quite a bit. It's like I understand that porn can be self-medicating, but why would I return something that creates the context of judgment? So I would say that, Jason, this is the gift of repetition in our lives. And one story that really shaped how I think about this was, I had two friends, Josh and Jeffrey. Jeffrey has two boys, and this was when I was living in Seattle. They went out hiking for the day in the Cascade Mountains. And then they got done with hiking and were coming back into Seattle, and they were getting about to get on an interstate. and their car was T-boned. And so their car was T-boned, and my friend Josh had to go to the emergency room. And when he went into the ER, they put one of those neck braces on him. And so obviously, like, very, very scary scene for Josh, but very, very scary scene for Jeffrey's boys. And so when Jeffrey got back to Seattle, uh, his boys, when they realized that they were safe with their mom and dad, they started reenacting the accident. So the boys became the two respected cars. They got the couch cushions, and they kept running into each other. And then they
Huh.
asked their mom to be the emergent or to be the ambulance, and then their dad was the doctor. And so they just kept recreating the scene, and like they put some type of neck brace on them. And for them, they did that for the next 2 or 3 days after the accident. And that's the glory and the beauty of
Hmm.
repetition, is that we need to repeat something to preserve the story so that the story can find its completion. And a lot of times, what happens within trauma is that the healing gets interrupted, that we don't have good parents that are able to process through some of the humiliation and heartache of our life. So we need to keep recycling it in the hopes that that script is going to go differently one day. And so that's one of the things that unwanted behaviors and porn sites preserve, is that they are often dealing with themes of power imbalances, humiliation, shaming, degradation, which are also some of the core stories that we have known in life. And so that's, I mean, part of the perverse nature of unwanted behaviors, but it's also part of, I would say, the opportunity for a lot of us is to heal some of those wounds. So when I was in middle school, my nickname was Donut. And the reason for that is I went to my middle school bus stop with a jelly donut and kind of a white striped shirt. And this was the era of the Pillsbury Doughboy commercials. And so people used to put their index finger into my belly and just go, ooh. And then I would walk around school, and my nickname would be Donut. And so, again, I didn't have parents at the time that I could process through some of the humiliation, some of the heartache of that. And this is always the difficulty with trauma, is in the absence of relationship. One of the ways that I began to resolve that trauma was through eating more food, but also kind of discovering unwanted sexual behavior in that season. And so, what I told at the beginning with regard to my seminary class, in my seminary days of kind of having disordered eating, but also struggling with unwanted sexual behavior, you could look at that as the hypocrisy of a seminary student, but you could also look at it as I was actually recycling my childhood story, where I was repeating some of those relational dynamics where I would listen to the needs of women, but then I would be eating a lot of apple fritters and donuts at night in seminary, but also looking at porn. Well, I was repeating middle school in grad school. And so that was kind of the gift of that experience, was, there are certain clues to my behavior that are trying to bring me back to some of the places of trauma and heartache that my story has known. And I think that's the opportunity within unwanted behaviors, is that it's often a place that we're going to feel a lot of shame over our behavior, but the behavior itself is kind of it's a symbol, it's a signpost to other realities that our story has known. So I hope that makes
Yeah.
sense. Happy to keep
Yeah. Yeah.
clarifying it if it doesn't. But
No, it does. And I imagine there's a big identity piece to it as well, that you start to believe that you, like, for example, are a failure, or that you deserve to be humiliated. And it's not simply what you do is fail and mess up and go back to the porn. It actually becomes who you are. So in a
yeah.
sense, it's just I'm reliving this because that's what I am. I am a failure. I am unlovable. I am unwanted. I am undesirable. And so it's not simply going back to behavior, but it's going back to a deeper identity piece, you'd say.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, the three realities that I'm always thinking about when trauma is named is, think about it in terms of fragmentation, numbing, and isolation.
Okay.
So anytime we have trauma, and just to define trauma, so trauma, people like Peter Levine and Gabor Mate would say trauma is not just what happened to us, but trauma is what happens inside of us in the absence of an empathetic witness. So it's not just something harmful or difficult, it's what happens inside of us when we don't have an empathetic witness helping us through some of those difficult places. So that fragmentation is just this sense that there are fragments everywhere. The memories, the heartache, the tears, the sense of I just don't know where I belong. I don't know how to find language. So our life begins to fragment. And then when we're fragmented and feeling some of the pain of what we're feeling, the human heart cannot bear that level of heartache. And so, what we typically do is we begin to find things that can numb some of the pain that we're experiencing. So, that could be a substance abuse, that could be reading a lot of books to just dissociate from life and from pain. But it could also be finding porn at that particular phase in our life. So we have fragmentation, we have numbing behaviors, and anytime you have high levels of numbing behavior, you're going to increase your potential for isolation, right? So it's not a relational solution that you're finding. It's a porn use, it's alcohol use, it's screens to be able to numb yourself. And the more that we numb, the more that we are going to find more and more isolation. And so that trifecta really becomes the hallmarks of someone's traumatic experience. And that's often what they are doing later in life as well, is they feel fragmented. They don't know where their identity is. Like, who am I? What am I loved for? What am I known for? And I can't deal with the pain of my marriage, the pain of my, lack of purpose in my life. So I need to find something to numb. And then I'm going back to porn or infidelity. And then because of the shame of all that, I isolate way more. And then again, you're just recycling that original trauma that you went through with fragmentation, isolation, or numbing and isolation. So
I remember
that's the
reading,
repetition.
it makes total sense. And I remember, I think it was in your book, that anecdote of some guy in this Christian church had made a lot of dumb mistakes, not just pornography, but masturbation, prostitutes, strippers, all that stuff. And then he finally confides in another guy. And the guy basically says to him, like, well, look, if what you really want to do is look at porn and masturbate, go ahead and do it. And, the other guy is like, what? No, like, if what you really want to do is look at porn and masturbate, then go ahead and do it. And I think the guy, like, slammed his hand on the desk and like, that's not what I want. And the other guy said, exactly. And it was kind of this watershed moment for the guy of the realization, like, well, maybe I'm not totally depraved. Maybe there's still an ounce of good in me. Some current running deeper within me that's aching for something different than I keep going back to and binging on that's never satisfying. And so to me, that whole theme of your book, Unwanted, not only resonates the feeling of being unwanted yourself, but going back to behavior you don't even want to do, and then unraveling the mystery of what's sending you back to that source of false consolation, and just having mercy on yourself. So after unpacking all this stuff, I mean, this is mind-blowing stuff. I'm sure a lot of people are like thinking right now, Jay, thank you for ripping my scabs wide open and then finishing the podcast. Like, what do people do now? It's just like, I can imagine there's a lot of listeners, kind of their heart aching and thinking like, wow, that hit deep, and I've got some searching to do. Where can people go to connect with you, your work, the courses you offer, the resources you have? Because I imagine this is really whetting an appetite of like, wow, maybe all the sin management stuff I've been doing, maybe I've been a little too hard on myself, and maybe it's just been kind of white knuckling it through this whole process instead of actually letting myself be loved by God. So, I think you've got a lot of people right now wanting to know, okay, how do I go deeper? How do I go find those roots, heal them at the core, so I'm not forever just kind of cutting the leaves? How do I go down to the root system and heal that? So what kind of resources do you have? Where can people go find them?
Okay.
And I'll make sure to put any links in the show notes as well.
Yeah, thanks for asking. You have this beautiful capacity to summarize, Jason, and then to ask it the next question. And I want to go back to something that you said, because and then I'll talk about resources. But, I find that too, that there are a lot of people who, like, is that the strongest desire of their heart? And part of what I would say is that unwanted sexual behavior can feel like the strongest desire from times, but is it the deepest? Is it the most true thing about us? And that's where I think we have to go back to just, the reality that we are made in the image of God. And so therefore, the deepest desires of our heart are not to be able to be in sin and to feel greater levels of fragmentation and entitlement. Some of the deepest desires in our heart are to know God, to be able to feel something of beauty and glory and awe and gratitude for this life that we've been given. And I think that's, what I would say to all the resources is, yes, I have a lot of resources, but it all goes back to that sense of like, what is the core of your identity? Like, are you beautiful? Is there a sense of being masterfully made in the image of God? And that's what we're going back to, is we don't just try and find freedom from sin, but it's always a sense of kind of the Galatians, it is for freedom that you have been set free. And so that's kind of the hope of a lot of these resources, is it's a freedom for, not just a freedom from approach. So we do. I have like an unwanted workshop that we are probably going to run once a month or so, that people can just kind of go deeper into a particular workshop. We have something called the Journey course, which is about a 5-month program that if you want to do, we didn't want to just deconstruct the notion of accountability. We wanted to create an online course that actually taught people how to do accountability, but not just about, a win-loss record, but actually caring about people's stories. So the Journey course is available for people. We also have, it's called the Unwanted Guide training, and this is for pastors and therapists and coaches. If you're in any leadership position, we go through about a 13-week training for people to go deeper into their story so that they are more effective in equipping others. So we have that, and do a number of conferences and events each year as well. So my website is jay-stringer.com. And on that website, you'll see a lot of resources and events that are coming up.
Awesome. Well, we will put the link in the show notes, and just wanted to thank you for allowing God to kind of crush you like a grain of wheat in a sense in your own journey, that he's been able to like deconstruct you and heal you and use you for such beautiful things. And so the insights today were pure gold, and I'm just super excited for everybody to just take advantage. Go over to Jay's website, support his work, get his books, take his courses, and just have compassion on yourself. As St. Francis de Sales said, have patience with the whole world, but first of all with yourself. And I think if you could sum up all your work, that's it. So Jay, God bless you. Thank you so much for all the ministry and the work that you're doing for the church.